Hi everyone, welcome. It's that day again. It's Tuesday. So for those of you that are watching live, well done. You made it. You made it to another Tuesday. For those of you that aren't watching live, you've just been through some adverts. Sorry, but that's the benefit of being here. You get no ads. That's the future. So for everyone that is online, welcome. We are going to spend the next hour, as always, going through that software, Capture One, and we're going to be editing your photos that you've sent in. So the raw images, and in some cases with edits, we're going to edit them together, hopefully interactively, otherwise it's a bit boring. And we're going to try and get them processed in a way that improves or gets them back to what you saw at the time, which isn't necessarily what comes out of the center of the camera. Sometimes we get a little bit of a disjoint between what our eyes and brain saw versus what the camera literally saw in light. And this is about trying to get things back to what you witnessed or what you saw. So for those of you that are online, please put in questions, put in comments, put in disagreements. As a note, last time we have got a weird blip, and I haven't worked out what the blip is, but sometimes Capture One seems to freeze, and no one knows until about 2 minutes later when I realise that no one's talking about what I'm doing on the screen. So with that in mind, if something looks like it's frozen today and it should be moving around, let me know. That's what the comments things are for. And hopefully we can try and work out what on earth is going on with it. It's not a Capture One bug, just to be clear. Oh wow, yeah, it's probably a streaming bug, because Capture One, from my perspective, carries on working. It's just the screen record thing that goes a bit wrong. So that said, let's get into what we're editing today. So Capture One being the company out in Copenhagen, or in Frederiksberg, near Copenhagen. In Denmark, they produce a RAW processor that allows us to take that data from the camera in RAW and produce it into, hopefully, a nicer version of it, or a more complete version of it, getting the most out of your camera. It doesn't mean you have to shoot in RAW. You can shoot in JPEG, and most cameras will have the option of doing either and both. So you can choose right out of the camera to shoot in JPEG. The downside to that is your camera is actually capable of storing a lot more data than that compressed JPEG that's stored by the camera is able to display. And we can manipulate that data to get some things back, like highlights recovered, shadows recovered, and all that sort of stuff. So it's if you've got the space on your memory cards, shoot JPEG and RAW. JPEG gives you your instant gratification. RAW gives you the ability to play a lot more later on. And to that end, so talking about that company, one thing we talked about last time, and the reason that we weren't broadcasting last week, is because we were in London doing an event for Capture One with Alessandro. Really great guy, Italian guy. We followed him around Cannes, the film festival. So for those of you that were at the event, hello. We saw you all. For those of you that were live or watching live at the event, well done, you made it. For those of you that didn't, fail, but you can still catch up on it. And genuinely, if you are into shooting fashion or events or anything, real time with some pressure or even press images, it's worth a watch, just for some of the insights that you'll get from Alessandro and that event itself. So there's a link. Oh, YouTubers do that, don't they? Ooh, like and share. There's a link down there somewhere. Please click through that link. It's the rerun copy on Capture One's channel, and that will give you access to it. There's no charge. It's all cool. You can watch it or not watch it to your heart's content, but it is worth having a look at if you're into those genres of photography, and others, actually. A lot of people commented that there was some other stuff that's quite transferable. Let's call it that. JD, I'm going to cover a couple of questions. So number one, Paul, is anyone having a bit of a block at present? If you mean because of humidity, yes. If you mean because of creativity, not sure. One thing, and it's funny, I was talking to someone the other day about this online. They said, I'm really struggling to get out with a camera. I said, well, when was the last time you went out with a camera? And he said, a couple of months ago. I was like, well, step one would be get out with a camera. So, part of it, although flippant, is that. Part of it, try something new, try something different, maybe try a different camera. It could be fun. But yeah, I'm sure you're not alone. Paul. In answer to JD's question, that's really difficult to look at on that screen, isn't it? So let's put that there. Have I updated my Mac lately? So I have still my Mac Studio, the Ultra, which is sort of souped up, which runs phenomenally with Capture One. I also have what is it? It's the 14-inch MacBook Pro M3 top one, whatever that is. I think with 128 gig, which just flies. And for video stuff specifically, it just eats up rendering. It's insane. I would argue that for Capture One, you can get away with a slightly lower spec. It doesn't need to be the top box in everything that you buy. Basically, any of the Apple silicon nowadays is just going to fly with Capture One. But yeah, so I haven't updated recently in part because there isn't a new, better one. But we'll see what's in the pipeline. So let's get into Capture One, and the version of Capture One that we're going into is this one. Thankfully, it hasn't changed. It's quite nice every now and then coming on and not having to update this screen. So we are using 16.4.3. To a post in the Facebook group, and funnily enough, for those of you not in it, have a look in there. Every now and then you'll see conversations that spark in there. And Prasad, I think it was the other day, talked about feature releases and version numbers and so on. And just as a reminder to everyone, the reason I give you that version number there is purely because if you're following along and you're on a different version number, you might find differences in the tools that are available, what functions you've got, whether it has a crash or a blip, or whether it has camera support or whatever. That's the only reason. Otherwise, if it weren't for doing this live, I wouldn't even look at my version number, to be honest. If I'd have a bug, I'd check for any updates. If I wanted a feature, I'd make sure I'm on the latest version that's got that feature. Otherwise, I'm never hitting that about screen. And I think you'll find that the move from Capture One going forward, especially with the new approach to licensing, is that version number becomes less prominent, let's put it that way. In the same way that other software companies do. It's basically version now or version old, and we're kind of in that place. So yes, we do point you to that is the version number there. If you are on an older version of Capture One, go into your account. You can work out what options you need to look at if you want to keep updated. You don't have to. If you are on that current version, great, you can follow along, no problem. If you're on a previous one, but it's sort of within a major version or two, so a 15 point something or a 16 point something, you're probably going to be able to follow along fine. The differences of late have been around AI masking and some efficiencies and crops and so on. But other than that, most of the stuff that we're doing is going to be compatible with what you're running. Okay, so... Oh, it was Prasad. There we go. I'm taking the yup as if that was Prasad. So, yeah, the version number thing, it is important internally to a software development company. It is important in terms of keeping an eye on whether you are on the latest version. But other than for verification, as you will have seen, most of Capture One's movement and direction of travel of late has been sort of in a mode of, can we forget the versioning and just keep you on version now? Obviously, if you have a perpetual license, you're fixed on that major release version, but to anyone else, they're not. Right, let's get into actual Capture One, and we're going to start where we left off last week, which was Brian. Now, Brian. So for those of you that don't know, I know Brian, David Grover and I, we haven't seen David for a while. There's David. David Grover and I spent a little while out in Yellowstone and around Wyoming with Brian. We did a live broadcast from there last year, did some shoots with him, talked about, actually a lot of stuff around behaviors and photographic behaviors and national parks and not being that person and all the other stuff. So I'm going to pick on Brian, basically. That was the preamble for that. Because Brian sent in this one last week. It was last minute. It was about 3 minutes before we went live. We didn't get to it, and he made a note. I think it was actually when we were online, saying that he wanted to send a new one in before I had a look at this one. And I was pleased. because in this one I saw lots of crushed shadows, lots of clipped highlights. If I turn on my exposure warning, the blue is equally not great as the red. So we all get worried about clipping highlights. I also get worried a bit about clipping shadows. We can do a lot more to recover a shadow in theory than we can a highlight that's completely blown, but obviously we bring up noise. So I was quite excited because Brian's going to send a new version in which fixed all that, and I got his new version, which is slightly less shadow clipped. So Brian, slap on the wrist. However, we are going to talk about how and why that's occurred, and actually we can skip to the why. What's happened is, and I know this temptation because I've done it myself so many times, you want to build contrast. And contrast is a great thing in terms of getting something that's vibrant and vivid and eye-catching. So, the doom scrolling that we all do now, where we spend seconds on a screen and then pass on because it's not caught our eye, is a problem for photographers, because what we try to do then is pander to it. And actually what we're then doing is manipulating what nature actually looks like to try and get an Instagram viewer's attention, which feels the wrong way around. I think maybe we need to calm down the Instagram viewers rather than amping up the nature. Because if I look at the original for this, I'm going to create a brand new variant. So not a clone, a new variant. So in other words, don't take any adjustments, just take the original and the original raw file. That's out of the camera. Now, and I say, and the reason that I'm sort of very conscious of this is I've done this many times. I've over-egged the contrast. And if I look at these two pictures, they feel, even though the structure's the same, they just feel like they're on completely different worlds. And where that's coming from is the fact that this one at the top here is just so I guess harsh is probably the right word. It's actually almost spiky, if I can describe an image. And I don't mean because it's Bryce Canyon. Bryce Canyon is spiky. But I'm talking about the tones, the contrast, the detail in it. And it's a natural tendency. It's a natural tendency to try and highlight things like craggy rocks and stuff like that. So if we look into here, and this is, Bryce Canyon is a stunning place. If you haven't been there, these are called hoodoos. It's all water runoff and so on, but it is absolutely incredible if you're in and amongst them. They're ridiculous things in reality. And the temptation is we want to really show the viewer how craggy and there you go, good word, Paul, crunchy they are, because they are. It's a good word. But oops, let me just go back into 100%. But what happens is not only do we increase some of the sharpness and some of the textures, which would be a structure tool and structure and sharpening, maybe a little bit of clarity. In this case, we've also amped up the saturation. We've pushed up the contrast. And the result is you end up, and especially when you push contrast, with pushing highlights that were really, really close to clipping already too far. So if I come over to the sun, this highlight as captured was actually pretty strong, pretty over the top. But actually, fun fact, all the data is actually there, except by using contrast tools. And on this one, it's only, I think, there's 3 on the main layer, but the challenge is, I think there's another bit of contrast there, a 4. I don't think there's a curve. The sky, we've got a shadow lift, which is, well, we'll come on to that, but no highlight recovery, no nothing like that. Again, I'm not seeing much in the way of a curve, which is good. And then a brighten layer somewhere. We'll have a look at that in a second. But whatever they are as individual components, they're compounding to push this sky far from recovering it and getting all the detail, but actually pushing it to be overexposed in some channels. But at the same time, because it's a contrast adjustment, because that adjustment has stretched the histogram, it's effectively pushed the highlights brighter to create contrast. But inversely, it's then made the shadows darker to make contrast. What was already pretty much a challenge down here is now definitely a challenge in terms of our shadow under exposure and effectively a clipped shadow. So in other words, it's got a value of less than 0. Means that we've lost all the detail, and we didn't need to, because there is detail in there. Let me just turn off the exposure warning. So if I go into this tree area over here, while it's not tack sharp, we can see individual trees. We can see all those different parts of the trees and branches. But by adding in all that extra contrast, it's gone, to use Paul's word, crunchy. It's flattened down. It's become almost in plates. It's a black plate. Interestingly, if you print this, what you'd find is really heavy. If you look across the piece of paper, especially in a reflective light, you'd see really heavy, dark, sort of black blotches, as it were, where these complete zeros sit. So, I like this shot. We're going to start, though, from a very, very different place. So I'm going to start from this position, which was the original raw. We're going to do some quick stuff. So I don't know what lens you're on, a 15mm something. Don't have the detail, I guess. Oh, Brian, was it a 15mm prime or was it the 15mm 15 to 35 R5? I'm guessing it was a 15 to 35, but maybe it wasn't. Could be wrong. I think, knowing Brian, it's probably that 2.8L. But if I'm wrong, he's going to correct me in a minute online, I'm sure. Shot at f16. So it is likely, not necessarily obvious or definite, but it's likely there's some diffraction in there. Oh, it's an Irix prime. Right, okay. We're going to stick back to generic. So we don't have to worry about using a manufacturer profile. I don't believe, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you would have loaded it in as well. I don't believe it's in there. So we're going to leave the generic profile. I am going to turn on chromatic aberration. So it's going to fix up anywhere where there's a high contrast point and try and get rid of any of those, stray magentas and greens and reds and so on. Diffraction correction, because at that aperture at f16, it is likely that you've lost some sharpness, especially out of the edges. And we can double check that. I'm going to go to 200% for your benefit, but that doesn't necessarily help too much. But that's without, and that's with. So I'll do it again. Without, with. I'm hoping you can see it on my screen. It is a very subtle difference, but it does help. It absolutely does help. Now, what I'm also seeing on this lens is while we're really nice and sharp in here, we're really quite soft out here at the edges. And this isn't about distance, because we've got close objects here that are soft as well. It's about it's about the sharpness fall off of that lens, which in some ways could be a form of diffraction of the edges. But Capture One has a sharpness fall off slider that not many of us use enough. So if you've got a lens that I have some, that have sharpness issues at the edges, imagine the sharpness fall off is like a vignette, but for sharpness. So instead of fixing light fall off, which we're all comfortable with, use sharpness fall off until it starts getting the edges sharper. Don't use it too much. If you push it up too much as default, you can actually make certain areas which didn't need it too sharp, and then you end up in a different place. So I'm in a place of this can come back a little bit. We do have some diffraction there. We do have a bit of sharpness fall off, but it's sort of working okay. I'm not actually going to use the distortion slider because in this case, it's a landscape that's very otherworldly anyway. The second I start trying to correct perspectives and correct lines, you end up actually losing some of the picture. So I've got a decision to make artistically. Am I happy to accept that I'm losing some of the field of view for getting something that's more straight and correct? Or am I just wanting as much as I can get into that view? And I want as much as I can get into the view, because the second I'd use distortion correction, while it's correcting that barrel of the lens, it's also losing a load of information. If I were to go to my crop, we can see how much it's losing out here. I can pull that back, but in this case, because it's so alien-like anyway, I'm just going to leave it. I'm just going to leave distortion correction off. Right, so that's our lens stuff done. Just in case Brian hasn't cleaned all his lenses, and I'm sure he has, but I'm going to click Remove Dust. automatic for quite a few versions now. That then goes through on the screen, and it finds anywhere that looks, as far as Capture One's concerned, to be a dust spot, saves us having to go through with the dust spot tool and doing it. So that's the basics. But there's one more basic that on this one is really, really important. Look at this histogram. I've got peaks right up here, and this is where it was exposed right up to the top. Now, interestingly, this isn't a clipped image. Let me show you. If I pull my exposure down, and this is where we were talking about RAW versus JPEG. In a JPEG, that's clipped. End of game. You can't do anything with it. With RAW, well, there is actually huge amounts of color and information in here. There is a little bit of clipping up here. So this bit here, it doesn't matter how far I pull that exposure tab down. I could do another layer with another load of exposure on there, while it will pull the value down up here from 255 to be 142 or whatever. There's no data in there. There's no differences. There's no texture, no color. It's just flat blown out. And all that's happening is it's pulling it down to be flat at a lower level. So we can't get all of it back, but wow, we can get a lot of it. So because of that, I know that there's an awful lot up here, and I certainly don't want to be pushing it further to the right. I don't want to be pushing it brighter. I also know I've got some worries about the shadows in here, because even though these shadows are pretty bright still, I mean, look, we've got 17s up here, 17 and 18, there's data there. What I don't want to be doing is, again, pushing that exposure down or adding contrast, because at a certain point, if I add contrast into here, we're going to start hitting nothing in there. So what I don't want is Capture One's automatic curve, which happens when you take in either film standard or auto as your curve in your base characteristics. So in my base characteristics, there's two elements. The first is an ICC profile. That's based on your camera. So that camera will be profiled by Capture One. Not all cameras are in there. Feature request if yours isn't in there. And Capture One will then use that profile to interpret in a way that means that it doesn't matter what camera I use. If I used Capture One to edit that picture and they were all using the same settings at the same place, they should be similar in look, because the profile starts to help correct that. And that's why you've got a, as it is now, Pro Standard profile. It used to be generic for each camera, but there's now Pro Standard, so that's the default. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about this curve, which Capture One automatically applies. And here's the problem. Because that auto curve, or film standard as a curve, is automatically increasing highlights and decreasing shadows, it's adding a pop, it's adding a bit of contrast. Why? Because it knows that that's what they know, that's what we generally do in our photographs. We try and expand the histogram. We get our highlights really bright, our shadows really dark. It gives us contrast, it gives us interest in an image, and that's what happens. But as a closer view of what the camera actually saw, we can use linear response. It's not exactly what the camera saw. Camera saw ones and zeros coming through a filter. But it's closer than this pushed or punched version, which is what happens if you leave it on auto. Auto, for reference, if you're on a Fuji camera or certain Nikon ones, auto actually is the film simulation that you loaded into the camera. But for everyone else, or if you choose film standard, it is film standard that Capture One's using. So I'm going to tell it linear response. And there's two reasons. Number one, I'm trying to protect these highlights a lot more. Look at that peak. Film standard, look at this histogram up here. Film standard, linear response. Film standard, linear response. So it's not about saving those highlights, because the raw data underlying is still the same, but it's about the starting point that I begin from. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I don't want to be putting in a load of effort to recover stuff that shouldn't have been pushed out in the first place. So with linear response, if I were to then do a highlight recovery, there's our detail. Lovely. Now, highlight recovery, remember, is only affecting this top sort of 1/3-ish, it tails off, of the histogram. Well, if I use the orange bar, look at what's in that top third, not this, not this, not this. It's only this stuff over here. So I'm not worried about doing highlight recovery on any other part of the image. It doesn't matter. So that's got me some detail and some texture back. Great. What about the shadows? Well, so my shadows here are actually pretty much dark. I mean, they're not completely at that end wall, but what I don't want to do is crush them. What I do want to do is lift the entire image so I get all my detail back and all my contrast, and we're going to work on in a second, but I get all that detail and all the texture and everything like that, and I can see into the valley without pushing the shadows darker. I want to lift the shadows up, but keep some contrast. So how do we do that? So the first thing, we are going to literally lift up shadows, and just in the same way, because this here isn't in the shadows, this slider isn't affecting it. It's only affecting the darkest parts of the image. So we're going to lift it a little bit. What I don't want to do, and please don't fall into this trap, that and that. I've lost all my contrast. Look at my histogram. It's squashed everything into the middle. Why? Because it's recovered the shadows, recovered the highlights. This is the opposite to adding contrast. So you can use a little bit of highlight recovery, or in this case a lot for the sky, and a bit of shadow, but be really careful that you're not sort of ping-ponging between the two, because as you'd use one, you're flattening, so you use the other one, and it gets very difficult. Joe, you just said, so what about using the white slider? So highlight is obviously the top quarter to a third with its tail off. The whites is like the top 5%, if not even narrower than that. So I can use white recovery specifically, and it will have an effect, but it's basically just the sort of cherry on the cake for that highlight recovery. It is improving it, so there's no issue with using it. The one to be really careful with in this case, because remember we want contrast, is black. So if ever I see an HDR set of slider boxes, I want to see, generally speaking, what was the priority that you were doing. Were you trying to recover highlights, or were you trying to recover shadows? If you tried to recover both, you may as well have painted it, because it looks awful. Don't do that. Don't be this person. So I'm going to undo that. So be really careful with the black slider. If you are going to use the black slider, use it to 3 or 4 points, and it's just going to grab the very darkest parts of the image and lift them up. If you overdo it, it becomes, indeed, JD, you're on message. It becomes cartoony. Don't do that. So what we've got now, I'm just going to do a quick before and after. So up here, or press the Y button on your keyboard. So we go from that to that, that to that, and some of you will look at that and go, "Oh, but it's lost all of its oomph, its contrast, it's gone." Right. But what I have gained so far is my sky back by quite a long way. What I need to do now is lift this. And here I have a real problem, because where the subject lies in my image is I want to push the viewer to look into the valley, right? And we generally follow light, and contrast. So the first thing I see is this as a viewer, and then I need something to grab my attention. Now, if I lift all of this, it's this snow that's going to grab attention. So I think one of the reasons that Brian's done this is to stop that from happening. The problem is, I quite like the snow. The snow is cool. It's part of Bryce. You know, Bryce is a horrible place to be if you're caught in a snowstorm. So let's celebrate it, because I'm pretty sure you weren't that warm when you were doing this, Brian. So let's get the proof that it wasn't cozy when you were up there. So first thing, let's add a new layer, and I'm going to specifically lift this snow. So I'm going to put on a gradient so it's nice and soft. So if I press M for my mask, great. And with that gradient, I'm just going to lift up some contrast, but most importantly, the midtones, because all of this stuff, look at my orange bar up here, all of this stuff sits in the midtones. Midtones are affected by a big clarity boost. I can, if I want to, lift it a little bit. I could do it through exposure, but I'm going to do it a bit with brightness. So that layer, really simple, is just lifting our foreground to make this whiter snow. Crunchy snow. There we go, Brian. It's miserable. I'm glad to hear it. Every time I've been in Bryce, it's either been way too hot or way too windy and cold. But kind of cool still, nonetheless. So, snow grad, I'm going to call that. But I said just now, the focus of the image I want really to be into that valley. I don't want it to be out here at the snow. So let's go back to my image layer. I'm going to do a couple things before we do anything else. First is a tiny bit of clarity boost across the whole image. And be careful with this because we don't want to push that contrast too much. Then, a little bit of structure. Structure's great for texture and all those detailed lines. So for structure, I want to really be doing it at 100%, but I can see that's without and that's with. Let's just zoom into 200 so you can see it better on the screen. So it's only 12 on that scale. You know, people quite often do this. You don't do that. You know, 12, 13, 14, that's plenty. So without and with. Without, with. Nice. So that's enough of that stuff. And then I'm going to use a bit of dehaze. So dehaze was quite a few versions back now. If I go too much, I end up close to where Brian did. Don't want to do that. I just want to knock out some of this tone here, this shadow tone that Capture One's already picked up on. So it's this stuff out here. If I were to undo temporarily, so without and with, you see it's a really subtle change. That's without and that's with. So I've now got a natural looking recovered sky, a foreground piece of snow that's still crisp and crunchy. It's not flat, so it's actually pretty close to where we were at in the first place here. But I want to really focus on the middle. How can I do that? Well, one way is I could vignette. So I could darken the corners of the shot to force the person to look into the middle. The other, and probably the more sympathetic way of doing it, is middle grad, a radial mask. So a nice soft round mask with the effect in the middle. And that soft round mask, you notice we're not even doing anything clever here. We're not doing luma ranges. We're not doing AI masks. This is just old school editing, as it were. But with this, remember I've got nothing that's really clipping in here. I'm going to turn on my exposure warning so I can see. A couple of little bits up there that we knew we wouldn't be able to rescue. But being mindful not to affect those things, we can now lift up our exposure in the middle and lift up our contrast. Remember, because the middle sits in those darker areas, the darker bits are going to get darker, which is why I want to then counter that with a bit more exposure lift. A lot more clarity. I don't want clarity to affect the sky or down here. I do want it to affect the mid-tones in here. Because all of a sudden, look from that without, that lift is huge. But you don't notice it too much because it's done a soft gradient. If I do that and that, you can see it, obviously. But if you just looked at this picture, you wouldn't notice it. Overall on that shot, let's go back to our saturation. And I can saturate a little bit. Just remember, some of these warnings up here are telling you that one or more channels is saturated or clipped. So adding more saturation to the whole image is risky. We only do it a small bit. Then I've got a challenge, which is I do want to protect my highlights, but I would like to lift overall that shot. So I'm going to go for an RGB curve. The reason for RGB is because I do want to affect a little bit of color. I don't want it to be just the luminosity range. So when you do a curve, we can use the luma curve, and that changes effectively the grayscale luminosity value of each pixel. But if I use the RGB curve, it's going to affect the different channels differently depending on where in the curve I'm altering it. So if I move the curve here up, I'm increasing the reds by a lot more than I am the greens and the blues, and that delta gets bigger between the two of them. So effectively, it can shift color a little bit, but in this case, I'm okay with that. First thing on this curve, we're going to lock in those highlights. I want to protect this from anything happening to it. So I'm going to put 2 little points on that curve, and that prevents anything from changing up here. We want to keep an eye on that at all times. Then we're going to lift these shadows along here. Now look at this up here. Some of it's being dragged into an area that we don't want. So I'm going to pull that back down. It's too much. That's pretty good there. And then the darker shadows, I am going to pull down a tiny bit. So I've got a really soft sort of humped curve. Now, to me, I'd be in a place where this is probably about as far as I would push it. There is a scenario where you could push this snow in the foreground a bit more. There is a scenario where you could push more contrast, more clarity. But, good question actually, Zach. Why 2 points? So, let me show you on a new layer. It's because Capture One is clever in an annoying way. So, why 2 points? If I put a click in there or an anchor, okay, and I lift this up here, what Capture One does is it tries to smooth out the curve always into a nice lovely S. But if I don't want an S, if I don't want to affect any highlights at all, well, that's a problem. So if I only have the 1 point there, as I do that, you actually start, I don't know whether you can see it enough, but there's a slight downward bend here. All I'm doing by putting in a second point there is I'm making the change happen here. So this is almost blocking any further S-curve from being crept in into there. So this is my anchor, as in nothing above there is going to be moved. This is my sort of buffer. It means that, yes, Capture One is going to try and smooth that transition out, but it's going to stop by this point because this point is anchored. So it's giving me more latitude to move stuff down here without affecting anything up here. It's to stop that auto S-ing that can happen a little bit. Okay, so let's just remove that one there. So that doesn't look like a huge amount of edits in theory, but if I go to the original compared to there, it is huge and it's a massive change. I'm not too happy with the sky at that point. I think actually the original one where we've got a bit more detail up here, it needs to lift a little bit. So what I'm tempted to do, be really careful with this. Let's try a quick AI mask on the sky. Nice. First thing with an AI mask, especially where you've got clouds and stuff on the horizon, is we want to refine that mask. You'll get to know this by eye if you had a look closely. In fact, let's do it. Rather than just saying, trust me, I'm a doctor. I'm not. But so if I go to our grayscale mask, so you can see this is the AI mask. If I refine that mask, I can effectively bleed that mask out. So it's less obvious where I've made the change and where that boundary is. So I'd be sort of about there. But you'll get a hang of that at some point. By the way, for those of you that saw a dark halo there, I'm not too worried about that. There always was in this picture. All that's happened is it's sharpened up a little bit. Just then we were at a silly zoom level where you're always going to see that. But with this sky layer, we are going to lift the midtones. Andreas, why do you use an RGB, not the Luma curve? Because I wanted to change some of the saturation in the areas that I'm adjusting. So where I'm lifting the shadows, I also want to shift some of that color to be a bit richer, whereas the Luma curve won't do that. It'll just lift up the brightness. So the two do slightly different things. Sky. In this case, I'm going to move our what we call gamma point up a little bit there, and I'm actually going to introduce a bit more of an S-curve, strangely, into the sky, again with RGB, because I do want to affect saturation. I am going to turn on my exposure warning to make sure I haven't made this worse than it was. Remember, just because it's a warning doesn't mean that it's actually white blown out 255. What it's telling you, look up here on the top, is that in this pixel, the red channel is completely saturated. The green and blue is not, red is. So I've got now a little layer that on there we've got a bit of a hump and a bit of a bump at the brighter end of the midpoint. So if I turn that off, a bit muddy, turn it on, a lot brighter, a lot more lifted, a lot more interesting. I can, of course, go back to my middle grad. Now I've got that, and we can push that a bit more if we wanted to. We could also shift our white balance a little bit to be a touch warmer, just in that middle, and actually a touch less red, believe it or not. I know Bryce is red, but I kind of just want to de-pink it a little bit. There's a new word for you. Right, that is where I would leave it. And I would include this snow in the foreground. But to me, if I go back to here, this just feels too much. It's too much in my eyes, effectively. I'm struggling. I have to struggle to look into the highlights. I have to struggle to look into the shadows. I don't have exposure warning on, but look at that snow out here. It's all gone blue. And it's because there's so many color shifts with all those contrast changes and so on. If I look at here, we're back to natural snow. This makes sense to the viewer, whereas this one is just a bit too much. It's just too harsh. If you printed them both big, I think this top one might be more impactful for sure. But you're also going to see more of that challenge when you're looking in the shadows and you're not seeing any detail or texture because it's just been crushed too much. So I'd be on this page. If you wanted to push it a bit more, because we've used the linear response curve, because we protected the highlights, because we protected some of the shadows, you can risk on this one, going back to my image layer, I would keep your exposure warning on. You can risk pushing a touch more contrast. You see that creeping in, be really careful with that. Overall, you can apply a bit more clarity into it. And if you wanted to lift it, I would use the brightness slider rather than just the exposure. If you use the exposure, it's going to go too far. This would allow us to do a bit more saturation. So, we can go from there to there. Maybe that's got a bit more pop in it. Let me get rid of that exposure warning. So we can do that, but I wouldn't push it to there. I would kind of be in that page. And if I compare that to the raw, so let's create a new raw variant. So that's what the camera saw on its sensor. The top is what we've got it to. And that's where I'd kind of leave it. I'd sort of step away, don't break anything anymore. Leave it at one of those two. Cool, that was quite a lot, Brian. But actually, it's a very good picture to show some of this stuff with, because the camera is doing its job. It is getting as much data as it can out of that scene. You can see in the raw, it was able to see all the detail in these shadows down here and allow you to lift them. It was able to recover a huge amount of detail in these highlights and settle them down. So the fact that we can even get to this is great. It means that your camera's doing the right job. You've got the right settings in there. If you'd pushed it any further, you would have completely blown out the sky. If you'd pushed it any further to the left, you would have lost the shadows. This is a tough, high contrast stuff is a tough world. Potentially, I don't know if you did, but potentially putting in a grad filter at the time of capture might have helped, but then you risk putting, darkness over the edge of the hills. So there's so many different variables that make this a very difficult shot to take. The temptation then, therefore, is to really boom it. But when we do that, just be careful that you're not losing all that data and all the detail that was the intention that you had when you went to go and take the shot. And I think that's probably as far as I would push it. Any more than that, and we start to go into painting world. And yeah, Jim, you have to learn when to say enough. I've done it many times, pushed it way too far. Lotfi, I'm not sure what you mean. How do you affect 255 in RGB when they hit the roof? If you mean everything is clipped at 255, it depends on the dynamic range of your camera. So one of my cameras, even if it is all clipped at 255, I'm pretty confident I can pull back about 3 stops worth, and it's still okay. But part of this is knowing your camera and your kit. Right. Quickly, let's go on to Nolls. So we've been teasing Nolls for a little while. And one of the reasons that we haven't touched Nolls' picture for so long is actually it's a good edit. We're all good. Actually, sorry, Lotfi. So if one of the colors is clipped, it's clipped. And the example I use quite often, if you take a picture of a red traffic light, you will have a red channel that says 255. You can't un-255 that. You can't pull that back. You potentially, if your camera actually has a bit more dynamic range that you can pull on, maybe you'd get some of the detail back in the red light. But if you've got a red light shining at the camera, you're going to have 255, potentially 00. You'd probably have some residual of the other colors. I think you're in a place where it's knowing what's happening. So some of that stuff is specular. So, traffic lights, we can't fix that. If you've got a green traffic light, it's going to be clipped at 255 and green at night. So you're going to leave that. You're going to leave that on its own. If it's a nature element or something that shouldn't be solid, that color, or shouldn't be illuminated and glowing, then I'd question whether the exposure was taken right. You might need to step it back a bit. And this is one of the risks of exposing to the right, that there will be some elements in that shot that you're risking pushing too far to the right. And if they clip, yeah, they're gone. Yeah, sorry. Francois, the picture of the linear response looks well. In some cases, you have a lot of work to reach the same with. Yes, you do. So the reason that I'm flagging it, let's go quickly back to Brian's. The reason that I'm flagging in this scenario, and it depends on the scenario, where I've got blown highlights and crushed shadows in the raw, not in the edit, in the raw, and I want to get the most out of the data that the camera saw, then starting from linear response is a good scenario or a good suggestion. You're not changing the raw data. So if you start from film standard, it is the same raw data. You have the same capability to recover stuff. It's just you're going to spend an awful lot of time fixing the S-curve that's been built in to that contrast profile for the auto or film standard curve. So I'm in a place where let's not start from there. In that scenario, let's start from a flat curve and add in contrast where I want it, rather than letting Capture One make the decision for me. So it's not a case of, one is better than the other. It's just, what do you want to spend time doing? Adding contrast or removing contrast? If you're happy removing contrast and recovering highlights and recovering shadows, start from film standard, start from auto, no problem. If you want an easier life when it comes to this, I would be in a place of, potentially starting from linear response and then building up the contrast profile later. Tim, yeah, so there are lots of tools out there. In fact, some of the camera manufacturers have the tools to do it as well. But yes, in order to see the content effectively, or the expanded histogram, as I'd refer to it, so the bit beyond 255 and the bit beyond 0 that your camera has actually recorded, there are other tools out there that can do it. And yes, the exposure evaluation tool in Capture One is not the actual raw data. It's what Capture One has interpreted as it. Alan, I feel like you're tending to spend too much time on one image. I agree, Alan. We have spent a lot of time on this one. One of the reasons being because it's got an awful lot of elements to it. So we have a load of stuff in there. Let's go on to Noll. So this picture, let me just go before and after. This one here, this one here. This is actually edited really, really nicely. And there's one trick in here. I'm not going to make many changes in here. There's one trick in here that I want you all to see. We haven't done for quite a while, but it is actually really valuable. And that is the reverse clarity and reverse structure. So if I look at our raw here, the temptation in this shot is to recover everything, to get back some highlights, get back some shadows. And actually that's what's gone on the different layers that are in here. So if I look at the land grad, there's a graduated filter on the land. It's lifted up. Where are we? Why is my filter not showing? Oh, it's because I'm on the before image. Silly. It's lifting that foreground up with an exposure change, not with an HDR change. If I look at the foreground, we've got a brightness pull, so that's darkening it down. So it's leading us up into where the sheep are. If I look at the sheep highlight, you can imagine it's not a natural highlight over there, but there's a levels switch to basically lift and stretch all the data in just that red area, stretch it all the way up. So we're basically making everything that was 199 now 255. So when we were talking about highlights, clipping and so on, this is almost the reverse. We're taking anything that was in the upper midtones, 199, and we're stretching it so it's now brighter up to 255. And then proportionately, everything between 199 and 5 in this case goes stretched either positively or negatively, depending on which side of this point, the midpoint, it sits. But Noll's only doing it on this area here, just this part that's in a gradient or a brush. And what that's giving us is a lift to the subject matter in this shot, which is not the sun. And this is, again, it goes back to the Brian scenario. What is the actual subject in here? If I look at this shot raw out of the camera, the sun is the subject. I can't see anything else. What Noll's done is change that around by using a specific layer with a specific change on levels on a specific area with a mask. And the effect is really, really nice. Now, the problem though, with all of that stuff, and I can't remember which layer it is on. I think you've got a sun layer. When you start recovering lots of stuff, let me create a new variant of this one. So let's say I lift my shadows and I pull down my highlights. Ooh. And let's do what we did in the last one, actually. Let's pull down the whites and see if we can get some detail in there. Well, I've now got lots of detail in this shot. But wow, that sun looks messy and horrible. So what Nolls done is something that we used to talk about this a couple of years ago now on these lives. Negative clarity and negative structure. So if ever you end up in a scenario where the sun or the light source starts appearing with a shape around it, which makes it a little bit uneasy to look at, a little bit uglier than we'd hope, the same tool that we use to build contrast can take contrast away. So what we do is on a layer, nice little mask, and that mask actually in this point is actually designed to shift our levels for a start, but most importantly pull down clarity and structure to 0, effectively as little of it as possible. And we used dehaze just earlier to get more detail back in. Well, we want less detail. We want to blow the detail out. So some negative dehaze, or rehaze as we jokingly call it, that all works by pulling down this slider. So this slider doesn't just go up, it also goes down. And you can choose effectively the color that you want to add. This goes from being what shadow tone do I want to get rid of to what do I want more of. And why does the area of the sun shift yellow when it's recovered? If you mean in here, Brian, it's because if I look, the underlying data in here is actually slightly yellow. So if I look at these numbers at the top, let me just actually pull up. Let's just reset our HDR slider up here. Yeah, it does give it me enough anyway to show you. Look at the numbers at the top. 254 red, 252 green, 247 blue. So red and blue, or sorry, red and green making yellow as a color in additive light. If I start recovering it, I'm going to be able to recover the blue more than the stuff that's more clipped in the reds and the greens. But effectively, I'm leaving more red and green and I'm pulling more blue away. What does that do? Well, it makes it more yellow. So as I start recovering, even if I did it with exposure, as I start doing that, there we are, 239 red, 232 green, 213 blue. If I was looking at just those numbers and sort of hiding the image, I'd know that was going to be a yellow area, and it comes from, even though it was pretty much blown out, there was still a slight yellow tint to it, or what do we call it? Tone, yellow tone to it. And as we start recovering, we make that tone more and more and more obvious, which is why you start getting that color. And ultimately, that light is slightly yellow in light. But this technique of adding in a mask, the only thing I would change on here, Noel, on the sun mask, is it tapers off too quickly, to my mind. So I'd actually be in a place of, and unfortunately it's a brush one rather than a gradient, but I'm just going to replace it with a gradient. I would go bigger, go big or go home, or whatever it is. I would actually go right the way up to there. Because that fall off, then I'm not going to get even this. I'm going to get that. I can back away the effect of it by shifting maybe our midpoint here, and I might do a little bit of a brightness fall off. But even in here, I'm still getting a little bit of that ring around the outside, whereas here we do actually get that full glare. And we can obviously shift this so we can make it smaller or bigger. But the one thing I would do is maybe make that orb a little bit bigger where the effect is applying. Then, of course, we've got a color balance tool that says my highlight in that area, I can actually make warmer as well if I wanted to. So I can make slightly yellow. Be careful it doesn't go green. I can make it slightly orange. We can play with that. You do have a sun flare here. Whether you'd fix that or not, I don't know. That's kind of your call. Potentially, you could use a quick healing brush over that sun flare. Make sure you pick the same line of the field so we don't lose any patterning so no one notices. There we go. There's another one out there. You know, you could do that, but from a technique point of view, lifting up specifically your subject with that dedicated layer in there, which is our sheep highlight layer, and not just trying to recover the sun. Sometimes it's not worth trying to recover it. Actually, if it is going to be blown out, blow it out. Actually make it really, really strong as a feature. And if you are going to do that, then just make sure, what in my experience with this, I'd want to make sure the effect goes bigger than the sun that I'm trying to de-clarity, effectively. Don't know what the opposite of clarity is. Unclarity. Anyway. Right. Roger. Experimenting, with, that's the wrong one, experimenting with negative space and high key. And actually, I quite like this as an experiment. You know, you have pushed it. It's pretty high contrast. It started off a little bit softer. The toning of it, you know, if I looked at that straight out of the box, I'd be happy with that. Funnily enough, there is only one change that's really quite significant in this that I do. We'll cover that in a second. So, guides, first thing, and I was demonstrating last time that I could add guides, and I want them to be red again. Thank you very much. So first thing, is our horizon level? Yes, well done. Because the amount of people that don't get that horizon level. Oh. So if you are going to make a feature of the horizon and a nice straight line, then make sure it's a straight line. Please don't have it non-leveled. I don't mind if the camera's not level. Sometimes there are scenarios where we just can't do it, especially if you're on a ball head and so on. But that finished image has got to be level. That's the first thing, especially if it's quite a minimalist shot, because I'm looking then for things that I can anchor my eyes to, one of them being geometrics. The crunchiness of it, or high contrast of it, yeah, Roger, yeah, you passed. Well done. So the crunchiness, just be careful with it a little bit. You've got a layer over the town, and with that, you've got a huge amount of contrast added to it. I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but if I were to pull that back, it just softens a little bit. It just takes away some of that sort of, I guess it feels almost brittle in some ways. And bear in mind, your contrast adjustment was on top of stretching the levels. So you've actually pulled the highlights brighter, the shadows darker in your levels tool, and then added contrast on the top. And it's probably a little too much. So I would personally back it away just a little bit. So we go from there to there. Maybe that's a bit too much. I'm going to add some of the contrast just back in, just for those trees. I don't want them to be hazy, but this just feels a bit too binary. It can be a style that works, but I want to see at least some sort of green, I guess, on the trees. I might put a touch, because I've backed away those levels, the contrast tool's having less of an effect. So I'd sort of be there. But the one change I would make, and I was tempted originally to say about the sky. So you can, obviously, there is a layer here. You can play to your heart's content with the sky. Roger's Roger's already brightened it by quite a huge extent. Using the brightness tool rather than the exposure tool means we don't push anything off the edge. It saves that. Bear in mind, again, you've got levels and brightness, so nothing wrong with doing that, but do keep an eye on the fact that because we've already adjusted our levels, any change to the brightness tool or exposure tool is going to be accelerated even further. But with that sky, it's interesting, isn't it? We lift everything up and then we recover the highlights and recover the whites. You can put in a touch of saturation in there to give it a bit more mood. That's your call. I might leave it there. But here's the one change I'd make, and it is only one. I'd change your crop, and I'd be at 1:2. And I would put that tower on the 1/3, and I'd pull this across. It doesn't really matter where it sits. I wouldn't have a bit of a dark cloud up here. I want to complete these two, so I think my line has to come about there. But that would be my shot in terms of crop rather than there. Reason why is balance. I'm offsetting. I've got a lot more anchor as it sort of feels. So there's a bit more weight on this left-hand side, which balances the huge, great big area on the right-hand side. Effectively, I can get away with that right-hand side because I'm offsetting it with the left. It also means I've got a point of interest on roughly a third line. Here, let me put on our grid, it's off to here, it's off to the side. So it already doesn't quite fit that nice, flowing, smooth approach to composition that people say is the holy grail. I don't buy that. But in this case here, this just feels a little more calm, a little more comfortable. I can actually bring this down a bit. I do want to keep some of this water line here. There is a challenge, which is because the island comes towards you, or the peninsula comes towards you, it almost feels like it's not level, but we've checked EDs. But I would be there, not necessarily there. And that's just a taste thing. And from a crop, that would be where I'd end. Here, look up here, I've got sort of murky clouds going off the edge of the print. I've got a lot of stuff up here. It is great negative space, but I think here makes me look at this subject and have it in isolation rather than a load of isolation and there happens to be a subject in there somewhere. But yes, to JD's point, both the last two images are really not, they're great images. And interestingly, if I look at the original, you can see the difference. So this is a style. It's been stylized and it works really well. It has a minimalist feel. The original did already, but it was a lot more pastel, a lot more soft, a lot more warm. This has now got a style about it, and that's what Roger's added to it. If I look at Nolls and look at the original, a lot of people would have looked at that and maybe not even bothered editing it. But just that little extra mask. You look at everything else around this picture. Yes, it's been lifted. It's a similar way to Brian. It's been lifted. The shadows have come back. The colours have come back. The contrast is there. But it's that little selective mask that gives the impression that the sun is just lighting up these guys. And I think it probably was. But that's quite a big emphasis in the final version. But it works well. And then to go back to Alan's challenge of we're spending a long time on this image, it's the same techniques that we're looking at in this image and every other one that we're looking through. So if I look through with Rogers, in theory, we could have started from a new variant and we could have started with our base characteristics of linear response. But I'm now going to have to spend so long, if this was Roger's vision, the amount of time I'm going to have to spend now getting that contrast into this shot is wasted when I could have just started from having already a film curve in there, film standard. So that's linear response, that's the auto or film standard. If that's closer to the outcome or the output that I want, why would I not start with that? So linear response is a great curve if you need it. If you don't, and this is closer to where you want to get to, and that's your final output, that's where I'd use it. Prasad, very quickly, because we're a little bit over time, but just curious to see a black and white version of Roger's image. Let's have a look. So let's just create a clone of that variant. Really easy, obviously capture one. Enable black and white here. Now what you would have to do is tweak a little bit. So we might want to darken those green trees. We might want to pull down the blue and the cyan channel to get some of the cloud and this structure back. Might want to lift magentas, yellows and red. Where are we at? Let's leave that down there. That's the black and white. You could afford, because it is in black and white, to make it a little more crispy in terms of the contrast. So we could go back to our levels on the overall image layer and do that. That might work nicely. But let's just get rid of that label so you can see. So we go from, there's the color, there's the black and white. Personally, I prefer the color in this. It's got a little more interest to my eyes. But black and white works perfectly well too. And yeah, experiment. Get the shot edited to the place where you're comfortable and then play. Play with black and white, play with a tint, play with a color editor and so on. So well done, everyone. So Roger's shot there, literally you saw there's a couple of little tweaks just to make sure we're not crushing stuff, but it would just be a crop thing. And that's a personal decision, Roger. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just, to me, this feels a little bit unbalanced. This just feels a lot more calm. And if I put that on a wall, it would be nicer. Noel, good job. The only thing on this, if you are going to use that technique in the sun, do it. If you are going to blow out the sun and blur it and lose all the detail, then do it that way, but make it bigger than just the sun itself, or you risk just shifting that line, I guess, from being the sun to being the edge of your mask. And Brian, yeah, the shot itself isn't an issue. This is a lovely view. I love this as a panoramic. It works great, but just be careful you haven't pressed all those sliders to 11. Yeah, I get it. I've done it. Everyone has. Sometimes, again, use that black or before and after tool. Always keep doing that. Keep an eye on it, and you'll find that you end up with a lot more subdued or natural edits. Right, everyone. So we are going to be back on, I'm looking at a calendar, the 30th of July. So not next week, but I think that works out the week after. Is it the week after or the week after that? I think it's maybe 2 weeks. 2 missing weeks because I'm off traveling. But for everyone in the meantime, let me just press a button. You can carry on talking about feature requests for Prasad. He was looking for lots and lots of people to back him. On there, you can join masterclasses. They're all on pre-record, so you can go into the description link and you'll find them there on different subjects and your call. Please do, if you're interested in event and fashion stuff, have a look at the Alessandro live stream. There's me and Tina and Alessandro and Raphael and Grover and Robin and other people from Catcher One there too. But in the meantime, look after yourself. Send in images. The way you do that, obviously, is the upload tool, which is also in the description, but paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. And we will see you on the 30th for the next time. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.